Today we have an encore appearance from Professor Robert Mooney, who gave us the Blake a few weeks ago, and we're still we're still reeling from that wonderful reading and discussion. And today we're going to talk about The Dead, James Joyce's short story, and also just about Joyce. Professor Mooney has been a Joyce aficionado and scholar for many, many years. And so I want to get his take on this story. Welcome, Bob.
Good to be back.
The Dead. Hell of a title.
It almost sounds, to my students when I teach it, they think it's, like a Halloween special.
Right.
What's this about? But of course, when you read The Dead and reread The Dead, I've read this story I don't know how many times, and I still get different feelings and ideas out of the whole experience. I mean, it is so beautifully written and so simple in its presentation, you don't realize how wise and smart this story is. And of course, every word has its different connotations, which allow for multiple readings, allows you to keep reading this story, and so much of all of Joyce, really. As you grow older, decade after decade, you're bringing, something else into it, and it's there to meet you. But of course, the word "the dead" and death is apparent right from the very beginning of the story. Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. Think of how just the whole idea of death and resurrection, which is a huge part of Joyce's idea of the dead coming back to rear us. Lily, the flower that you see at a funeral parlor. It is a symbol of death, but it's also the flower that is in the Christian service at Easter that represents resurrection. And it's the caretaker's daughter's name. So right from the very beginning, and as you go through those early paragraphs, you get the wheezy hall door or doorbell, the literally run off her feet. The idea of so and so, you get in here, you're going to catch your death of cold. All this woven in and playing in the back of your head as you're watching this party begin to take shape, and it's a party.
Yes, and of course that runs right through all the way to Sue. We're talking later about in Gabriel's mind saying yes. He's talking about Julia. She will one day soon be a shade.
Yeah.
So the theme of death. So, but I guess my question would be, so what? What's that about?
Well, it goes to, I think, a primal truth about our humanness. You notice that Gabriel either has an awakening or is certainly invited to a personal awakening and enlightenment regarding his life and life. And the necessary door to pass through is admitting to death. When he admits she will be a shade one day too, of course, he realizes I will be too. What does it mean?
Mm.
The question that we all ask ourselves at some point, and sometimes talk about it with roommates at 4 a.m, but otherwise try to suppress. And it's in the suppressing of it, I think, that Joyce dramatizes our own sort of deadness as we're living our lives. Gabriel comes to life through this realization and through suffering and through admitting his many mistakes. He begins to annihilate his own ego, which has been in the way all along of his ability to love. And if that's not important to any of us as a human being, we've dehumanized ourselves.
Hmm.
Where we spend our lives protecting our egos, as Gabriel does through most of this story. The story is really a systematic breaking down of his ego, so he can kind of sacrifice himself and resurrect into love.
Hmm.
That's to me what it's all about. It's even more important than what I'm having for dinner tonight.
Well, that's always been one of the biggest paradoxes for me is, when he says he knew that he had never felt that way toward any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. And you want to reach into the story and shake him and say, no, no, Gabriel, what you're experiencing is this mature giving up of ego is far deeper and more profound than anything the youthful Michael Fury could could feel, just because it's so hard earned and so long suffering. So
Do you mean that Michael Fury's love was more hormonal?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
But in that, it serves as a metaphor. When Greta says to Gabriel, "I think he died for me," his death, Michael Fury's death, is teaching Gabriel, I must die for her to actually realize my love for her,
Mm.
to actually be able to love. So basically, this epiphany. I don't know if you've talked about Joyce and Epiphanies. This kind of personal revelation that he has is huge. I can't think of anything more important, to a human being who is trying to live fully, is to learn how to love,
Mm.
and know what's involved, and make that sacrifice, and die into it and resurrect through it, which is pretty much what's happening here.
You mentioned Epiphany. Why don't you tell us about that, Bob?
Yeah, Joyce grew up, in Catholic Ireland, and the Epiphany, some of you may know, is actually a feast celebrated by different Christians, certainly Catholics, January 6th. And what it celebrates is the showing of Jesus to the Magi in Bethlehem. And basically what it is it is a celebration of the creator of all things coming into time and space and human life. So it is the ultimate revelation that the creator of creation is joining creation on its terms. This is at the core of the belief. And the Epiphany is a Greek word, comes from a Greek word which simply means to show forth. And in that regard, Joyce has taken that from the religion of Catholicism and embedded it in his real religion, which was literature, art. And so in one way, you can see his stories and his novels as rituals or sacraments, sacrifices, but not in the Vatican sense, but in the very personal sense. How do we come alive in the world? And so an epiphany is more or less, sometimes it is, as the critic Harold Bloom interpreted it, it's overhearing yourself speak. It's hearing yourself say something you didn't know was in you to say. And often it's screwing up. And notice how Gabriel makes one mistake after another. He asks Lily, are you going to school? No, I'm done with that. Oh, you'll be marrying someday. Even back then, that wasn't a cool thing to say. And she says, men are just all that they can get off you. I'm not going down that road. He realizes he makes a mistake, so he does, the typical, male thing. He makes another mistake to try to correct that mistake. Dang, here's some money. And, all the way to the mistake of him thinking that Greta is lustful for him as he is for her. The kids are with a babysitter. They're in this nice hotel. he thinks that she's sharing his love, and they're going to have a good night together, and he couldn't be more wrong. She's crying for somebody who died many years ago and mourning the fact that he could love more than her husband, whom she simply says, "You're so generous."
Mm.
You know, she didn't mean it as such, but it slaps Gabriel in the face.
Mm.
I'm generous and well-mannered, and this dead kid who used to work in the gas works and was so stupid he went out in the rain to throw stones at your window is dead, and you like him more than me? What am I missing here? Which is exactly what the Epiphany comes to. Here's what you're missing.
Well, the interesting thing too about that is that when this is the last story in Joyce's book, first book, the Dubliners, and prior to this story, I mean, the stories are so dark. I mean, representing what he called, the paralysis of modern life. And it seems to me that the Epiphanies are all for the reader. It's the reader who gets the epiphany. None of the characters seem to have the self-awareness in those previous stories, and that's why this story is so pivotal, because it's the first time that that Joyce allows a character rather than the reader to be the one to have the epiphany and to be conscious of it.
Yeah, even then, he's just at the precipice.
Mm-hmm.
I must go westward.
Yes.
It isn't sure if he's going to take the next step or not. But that's part of Joyce's genius too, because characters can't do your epiphanies for you.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise he'd be presenting them like, often the church presents saints. Do that. It'd be okay. And we know that doesn't work. It's got to come from within. So basically what Joyce does is he provokes the reader by presenting reality as it is,
mm-hmm.
and creates a situation of tension, and actually indicts the reader. You can say, oh, well, she's paralyzed in the Joycean sense because she lives in Dublin, and it's kind of a state that's controlled by a foreign power, but that's not me. I'm an American and I'm free. That's hogwash. He's calling all of us on our own paralysis. Where are you paralyzed? How can you walk again? And he shows very realistic, often seemingly simple situations that we've all been in. And, does what great writers do. It makes the book a mirror. There was this German philosopher, I think Lichtenberg, said, a book is a mirror. If an ass peers into it, he can't expect an apostle to be looking out.
Last week, we read Yeats. And of course, the amount of compression that unfortunately a survey course places upon us makes it really impossible to kind of deal in depth with the historical context. But it's the Dead is looking, of course, at the same kinds of conflicts that we saw Yeats encounter, and of course Yeats is trying to awaken and enhance and develop that tradition, and Joyce is in many ways undercutting it, and certainly Gabriel, who rejects the idea that Irish is his language and that wants to keep in touch with the languages on the continent, is speaking, I think, for many of the citizens of Dublin who were skeptical about the Celtic twilight and Yeats's high idealism around this time. Talk a little bit about the class issues that are, embedded in this story and that really contrast Yeats and Joyce.
Yeah, I think, well, in The Dead, you can get somewhat of a sketch of how Joyce felt about these things with his interchange with Miss Ivors, and I would think part of what's going on here is class. Yeats was very unusual in that, I remember talking to our mutual friend, the poet John Montague, one time. John was having a good laugh, saying, here was this guy who was into the occult, and he was a central cultural figure in very Catholic Ireland, which would have frowned on his spiritual pursuits. But also Yeats was much more political than Joyce. In fact, Joyce was very apolitical. And I think we see that in Gabriel, who was kind of a model for Joyce if Joyce had never left Ireland. What would he have done? Who would he have become? Gabriel is an answer to that. And I think it, especially, having read Finnegans Wake, you see that Joyce is always reaching beyond the political moment to more of, how human beings deal in this cycle of the rise and fall of civilizations, and more the human heart and how it governs itself. Politics always involves movements, and movements always overreach. And I think that probably was Joyce's notion with Miss Ivors, who is both sympathetic but overreaching. Calling him a West Briton was an insult. She meant to hurt him just because he didn't value the Irishness that she did. But you'll note that Joyce, living in exile, never wrote about anything but the Irish. And if that isn't a love of your people beyond politics, I don't know what is. And he didn't feel as though he needed politics to get that across. His government was in his works. Yeats, on the other hand, was a senator in the Free State.
Mm-hmm.
He ran for office.
Mm-hmm.
He held political power. But to Yeats's credit, he created in a political vacuum for Ireland, couldn't govern themselves, a republic of words. He said, why don't we organize society not around parliaments and political leaders, but around literature? And I think Joyce had a lot of respect for that, even though he didn't want to partake in it, because he knew that can decay into something destructive as well, which eventually in Ireland it did, with censorship coming in. And, that's not, Irish people don't write about sex, for example. So there was a censorship board. Joyce could see all that coming and didn't want to get involved, I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not only that, but you've opened the door now. You mentioned Finnegans Wake. And one of the things that I think is it's incumbent upon us as faculty and teaching certain courses which are arranged as part of a greater curriculum and so on and so forth. And this is a survey course. So, Joyce on the one hand says, readers must devote their whole lives to me. Here we're devoting 1 week, which is probably the main reason why we've chosen this wonderful story, The Dead, to talk about. And you mentioned, Finnegans Wake. We certainly don't want to give the impression that that this was Joyce's masterwork. It was the opening of a door toward a career unparalleled in 20th century literature. And one of the things that the students will see is an interview with Colin McCann about why read Ulysses. And in the interview, he begins by saying, well, it was assigned to me when I was about 16 years old, so of course I didn't read it. and I think that's one of the things that when I think of my own experience with Joyce, I mean, my first experience that I remember was as an 18-year-old freshman at Bucknell's during January, and they had these January programs, which was just one-on-one and I had Professor James F. Cairns, and we started out by he said, well, let's do a survey of Irish literature. Well, within about an hour, we ditched that idea, and he just started reading from Ulysses out loud, and his book was full of these little notes, and he couldn't get past a page without laughing and explaining and talking, and I was pretending to follow along, you know. And of course, we didn't get very far into Ulysses that January, and I didn't get very much of it at all. But I got that he got it, and I think that's one of the things that we kind of hope for. I mean, that's why I put Cullum's interview and a little reading from Finnegans Wake, and that's why I'm glad to have you bring that up. And so I want to invite you to tell a little bit about your journey with James Joyce, not just with the dead, but your experience and the influence that Joyce has had over your life, your writing, and your teaching.
Yeah, I think, well, I was sort of prepared for this, or my life was marinating toward Irish literature long before I knew it, just because of my own background. You know, my parents were very proud, grew up working class Irish Americans, and they were readers, and so I think my collision with Joyce was inevitable, because if you're interested in certainly even 20th century literature, but also of course Irish literature, you're going to run into Joyce, and you're going to have to deal with him. And that's even more so when you have an impulse to write, as I have. You got to deal with him because of what he accomplished. I mean, he in a sense changed the rules, but not so radically as to be different for difference sake. My actual first encounter with Ulysses was in a college course. I was a sophomore. And it just so happens that the professor, Adele Dulcimer, it was the best class I ever took. Part of it was the excellence of Ulysses, but mostly it was her enthusiasm. I first fell in love with Ulysses by becoming enthralled with this professor, this woman that I quickly learned to admire, and believing that her enthusiasm was something that I wanted, and knowing that she found it in here, so I'm going to go in there and find it too. And it was just a blast. And the reason I think she was successful with me and others in the class that I'm still in touch with all these years later is she told us not to be afraid. When you start reading Ulysses, it's like, oh, this is beyond me, or this is trying to prove how stupid I am, or I don't get it. What you realize is that the brilliance of the book is Joyce is teaching you how to read differently, how to take in story in a way that you haven't before. That it's not something you run your eyes over and you say, yes, I read that book. If you've read Ulysses, it's an invitation to keep reading it for the rest of your life. And what I said about the dead is, true 100-fold for Ulysses. It just keeps giving. How does it do that? You read it slowly. You listen to it. I think that's a really good introduction. That's what Jim Cairns did. That's what Adele Dulcimer did. Listening, I'll listen to it periodically. Every few months, I'll listen to an episode or two on Audible. And then you realize, oh my God, this is a story. And what seemed to be scary about it was, the idea of homework is gone. It's what Joyce does in Ulysses is he takes away that mediation between author and reader, and he brings you as close to the actual experience as the characters are experiencing it without comment. You don't have, somebody explaining to you what's going on. It's simply the experience. And the experiences there are common to all of us. It's just one day in the lives of a handful of characters, negotiating the same fears and desires that we are. And we're with them, and we're in their heads, we're in their hearts. We're dealing with their problems on their terms. What's scariest about Ulysses is it really reading Joyce, it's like what happened to Gabriel. It strips away your ego, and then you're free. You run free through this beautiful work. But you have to give that up. You have to give up in a sense, your own certitudes and your own sense of yourselves. And that's what makes literature art. When it invites you to do that, guides you through it in some way by presenting story that is potentially meaningful to you. And I can't think of a single novel where that is more true than Ulysses.
You mentioned Adele Dulcimer, and I talked about my teacher, James Cairns, with whom I wound up having a lifelong relationship with. He was my mentor as an undergraduate, and after he retired, he and I collaborated on a book on Joyce together. So, I mean, it was he never stopped being my teacher. But the amazing thing too, and you'll recall this, it was maybe about 11 years ago here in Youngstown. Every Tuesday night we had a group that would read for 2 hours, read from Ulysses, and we read all the way from Stately Plump, Buck Mulligan to Yes, I Said Yes, I Will, Yes. And the amazing thing too was the group, I think, was able to support one another and activate that sense of bravery, that Adele Dulcimer was encouraging you to feel. It's a book. This is a book that in many ways needs to be approached in the company of a mentor or of friends. And one of the things I took away from that reading, which was, people just reading for a page or two and then handing the book on to the next person, was that you mentioned earlier, literature is a mirror, and you were getting different versions of these people that you knew saying these words, which were new and unfamiliar to them and oftentimes unpronounceable. And you were hearing their voice in ways that you'd never heard it before. And this kind of incendiary collaboration. So, I mean, one of the things that I hope happens to at least some of the people listening to this is that they'll hear our enthusiasm and maybe want to go out and read the book themselves. And I guess my first piece of advice would be, well, careful, don't do this at home. Take somebody with you if you can. Yeah. You'll be safer.
I think Joyce would be certainly encouraging of just that. And in fact, evidence of that may be in his next novel, Finnegans Wake. His protagonist's name is HCE, which stands for, among other things, here comes everybody, and you're all invited. Come as a crowd.
Yeah.
And I think basically, aside from the enthusiasm, like if you're going to take the word of somebody like Dulcimer or Cairns or Brady or Mooney, the next thing that we need to say to the young Ulysses reader is, don't be afraid. Take your time. Live with it. Live with the page in your head. There's something on every page that can send you into, I think, really interesting personal meditations. But even Ulysses itself, you talk about courage. It begins with an act of courage where Stephen Dedalus is being chided by his friend for not seeing through his mother's wishes at her deathbed. She simply asked Stephen, would you pray for me? And it didn't quite align with Stephen's way of how prayer and death worked. So he had his own principles as a young man, and he had his love for his mother, and he had to make a choice. So it's really not about the difficulty of the text so much as when you calm down and get into it, that it asks these wonderful moral questions on how do we become who we are, with the level of integrity and sense of honor and honesty that we hopefully demand of ourselves, and showing that it's not an easy road.
Bob Mooney, thank you so much for sharing this on a beautiful May day as we approach the apocalypse. But we'll do so with your words in our hearts. Thank you so much, Bob.
Well, thanks for having me back. Good to be back.